The right to light, which you have in the UK, says that if a window has perceived a light through their windows for at least 20 years or longer, you have the right to remain that light.
In Sweden, between 1875 and 1960, daylight requirements were regulated by adjusting building distances and heights. They didn't have all the tools that we have today, but they had an understanding for how important light was and how to let the light in. Then the obstruction angles cannot be too big.
The problem is that what is completely ignored in terms of early studies and urban design is sunlight. We don't have enough of knowledge about sunlight and how it affects our lives. But it is ignored, unfortunately, in the planning process. The municipality services, they talk about shadow study. Now, shadow study is a great tool. However, the next step is to talk about hours of sunlight. We need to move from the shadow to the sunlight.
Welcome to Sunlight Matters, the podcast that reconnects us with the sun. Join us as we explore the power and influence of our star, the force at the heart of everything. Each episode, we speak with leading experts to uncover the ways sunlight shapes our world.
Welcome to today's episode of Sunlight Matters, and we're trying something very different today, which is to talk to three incredible people. If we could start with introductions, that would be amazing. So Mina, do you want to start with an introduction to yourself, a bit of background, and then obviously we're here to talk about light and rights to light. It would be great if you can just talk a bit about how you got involved in the subject.
Yes, so my name is Mina Gaarder, and in May I finished my master thesis in civil engineering here in Norway, where I studied daylight in dense urban areas, focusing on how daylight is regulated in Norway, how the regulations are applied in practice, and what we might learn from other countries. So my interests lie in how densification affects daylight and how daylight relates to housing quality and our health.
Fantastic. Well, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Susanne.
Yes, Susanne Höglin. I live in Stockholm, and before summer I just finished my studies as a building permit architect, having previously worked for 6 years as a case manager in Stockholm Municipality with planning and building issues. And at the same time that I started my studies, I also started to work with Paul and Eftihia at ACC with daylight and sunlight studies. And I really got interested in this field of knowledge and wanted to know more. So that's why I decided to write my degree project about daylight and to examine one densification project in Stockholm. So,
Fantastic. Well,
yeah.
welcome to the podcast. And
Thank you.
Eftihia.
Yeah. Hello from me. I am Eftihia Stamataki. I come from Greece. I live for the past 9 years in Sweden, and the last 7 years in Stockholm specifically, where I work in ACC Glas och Fasadkonsult. I'm an educated architect from Greece, and I did a master with energy efficient buildings in Lund. And my interests lie mainly in daylight, in thermal comfort, and the past years with all of those cases in Sweden, especially in Stockholm rising with the upcoming densification, I have worked a lot about the daylight and sunlight access together with Susanne and with Paul Rogers from my colleague on a lot of them. So yeah, I'm happy here to share my experience with the rest of the people here. Thank you for having us.
Oh no, well, look, it's brilliant to have you all, because I think the daylight and the way we live our lives and our homes and is such an important topic. And I think, you know, from everything that I've kind of understood, it's something that is often relegated in terms of a priority. And I think, you know, it's great to have all of you, because I think, you know, you bring a perspective which is is really sort of interesting around, the consequences, but also the sort of legislation which sort of hangs around it. So Mina, I'm really interested in the research that you've done and the MSc that you've just done. And I wondered if you could start by just giving us a general overview of legislation as regard to things like right to light, and some of the differences between some of the different countries.
Yes, so in my master thesis, I compared how daylight in existing buildings is regulated in both Norway, Sweden, in the UK, and I looked at some states in the US. And out of the 4 countries, the UK has the most established system in my eyes with the right to light legislation. And what I found in the United States is that there is no federal right to light, but the regulation differs between the states and the cities. And something I found very interesting was California. They have a Solar Rights Act from 1978, which protects access to sunlight for solar panels, primarily to support renewable energy and not the residential daylight.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
fascinating. I mean, a couple of things in there which are really
Yeah.
interesting. One is that the UK is the most advanced. I mean, that's
Yeah.
good to hear that, here am I in the UK that we're doing something right. It so often feels like we're not. Can you give us a bit of background on the legislation and what right to light actually is?
Yes, so the right to light, which you have in the UK, says that if a window has perceived a light through their windows for at least 20 years or longer, you have the right to remain that light. And that is something I found very unique coming from a Norwegian perspective.
Well, so that sounds like somebody somewhere along the line in the past has sort of really thought that this is important. And I guess, the UK, I'm sat here on a very dreary day, and I wholeheartedly sort of thank that whoever that was who kind of brought that legislation in. But it is interesting because there is a case going through the courts at the moment where somebody's having their right to light impinged, I think, by construction in a place in London, and I presume that they'd be using that legislation to take the developer to court.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. And then I'm interested in what you said about the states as well, because from a Californian perspective, that whole thing of protecting the energy production rather than people's sort of sense of well-being. Is that sort of common across the US, or is that particular to California?
That was particular to California. And then I looked at San Francisco. There I found something called Proposition K, which is from 1984, which prevent new buildings from casting shadows on public parks. Yes, so that clearly links the daylight to health and well-being.
So, I mean, and that's interesting because, that sort of touches on the effects of landscape in terms of this as well. So, that's fascinating that they're sort of protecting the parks. I mean, have you got any idea as to why that would be?
No, I can't remember now, but I remember it's preserving the daylight in over 70 parks across San Francisco. So, yeah.
Well, maybe that is to do with health and well-being as well. So making sure that people can get into parks and sort of enjoy the maximum amount of sunlight. So, so in terms of because you're based in Norway, aren't you? And
Yes,
so
I am.
What's the legal framework like in the Nordics generally?
Yeah, so the Nordics, I found it's very similar to Sweden, which I'm sure Susanne and FT will talk about later. In Norway, we don't have any rules protecting the existing buildings, but we have regulations regarding when you build something new, and those regulations for daylight is written down is something we call Tech 17. And for daylight, Tech 17 requires either an average daylight factor of 2% in rooms such as bedrooms, living rooms, or kitchen. Or
Sorry, did you say
can
2%?
2% average daylight factor. Yeah.
That's... Well, at least it's something, hey.
Yeah. Or Tech 17 also open up to use of a simplified version, which is the wall to window ratio. And in order to use that rule, you can't have an obstruction angle of any more than 45 degrees.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So,
Yes.
Susanne, how does that compare to Sweden and the legislation in Sweden?
Yeah, very interesting to hear about the 2%, because in Sweden it's 1% daylight factor that is the limit, the lower limit. But
that just seems extraordinarily low.
I want to point out though that one is median and the other is average.
Right.
So normally a 2% average will have a good correlation with the 1% median. It's a little average. We use median in Sweden because it's considered to be more representative of a room's area.
Okay.
So that's a little difference there. And I think some other countries also have average.
Okay. Very interesting.
Just the calculations person here.
But I don't know. To me, it feels very low. But at least it's something.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Something.
Yes, but just like Mina mentioned, my interest also lies very much in the difference between new construction and existing buildings, and that's what I wrote my project about. But generally, you can say that daylight legislation in Sweden between 1875 and 1960, daylight requirements were regulated by adjusting building distances and heights. So there weren't any precise numbers, but from the 1970s and onwards, the requirement has been set in the form of a daylight factor. So this 1% of the skylight outside must reach an indoor surface. So that's a general overview.
So can you just sort of talk about the old legislation versus the new legislation? Like, what were the impacts of changing it?
I think this is very interesting, this working with the distances, because they didn't have all the tools that we have today, but they had an understanding for how important light was and how to let the light in, and that then the obstruction angles cannot be too big. So it was like a general plan in Stockholm when big parts of Stockholm were being built in the end of the 19th century, that the streets were to be 18 meters wide and the houses 19.5 meters high. And that relationship would assure enough light to get in. And later on, we have been able to see that there are some problems even in these areas, but at least it's a good ground rule. But today we don't have that anymore. There is no lower limit for how wide a street should be or the distance between two houses. And we can see now in recent development plans that sometimes the distances can be very short, even down to streets 13 meters wide, or courtyards, inner courtyards being as low as 13 meters wide. So
and was the change to reflect the fact that, you know, they wanted more people, urbanization, if in effect? Did they want to allow for taller buildings to be built? Or, you know, I'm just kind of interested in why the change happened.
yeah, I think there is this great densification going on since the beginning of the 21st century. Stockholm city has a housing goal to build 140,000 dwellings or apartments until 2035, I think. And basically that's to be compared with the new Million program, this this huge public housing project between 1965 and 1974, when the state built 1 million houses and apartments, but all over Sweden. So this 140,000 is only in Stockholm and can be compared to that. But then in the 60s and the 70s, the areas where they built, they weren't. There was nothing there. It was green spaces but today you have to build this in already existing environments, and that's a real challenge. And to fulfill this housing goal, that means that the buildings become quite high and that they have a short distance to each other.
So you've kind of got this balance between light and the need for housing, in essence.
Yeah.
And I guess that's been played out across, you know, the whole of Europe and probably North America as well. I mean, maybe less so in North America, where they have a bit more space to kind of build into.
And so many other parameters as well. I guess that's the problem, that daylight and sunlight is only one of all the aspects that you need to weigh in and consider in a local development plan. So,
but can you give me a sense of how important it is, like as part of that planning process? So, you know, what priority is light given? So, you know, again, I've talked to a few people from an architectural background and people like Paul, and what you get is a sense that, you know, light is often not considered until towards the end of that sort of architectural process. So I was just wondering if you get any sense of its priority.
Yeah, I think that's the key, that it's important to get it in very early, actually, when you decide the distance between. I mean, later on you can make some adjustments, you can change maybe the color of there are lots of small things you can do, but it's in the early stage when you set the plan that you need probably to consider the daylight and sunlight issues.
Fantastic. And after here, I'm really interested in like the Nordic context, but also how that kind of compares to Southern Europe, where I'm guessing daylight isn't such an issue. But I guess starting question is the 1% or the 2%. Is that's taking into account the changing seasons and winter and summer as well? Because I presume that the sort of shadow map of a building is going to be vastly different as the seasons change, particularly in the Nordics.
Yeah, now exactly, that is a great point, and I'm going to connect. I'm going to connect what I want to say with what Susanne just said. Now, daylight has a quantitative requirement in Sweden. It has this 1% median, 2% average in Norway. However, this refers to daylight factor, so we're talking about irrelevant to orientation, location, and weather.
Okay.
The problem in Sweden is that it's a country compared to the south of Europe that I can talk about, Greece, is that it actually has a quantitative requirement. The problem, and it is being taken into account, and in urban studies in some way. We would like a little more earlier, but it is. The problem is that what is completely ignored in terms of early studies and urban design is sunlight. There is a very big we don't have enough of knowledge about sunlight and how it can and how it affects. We know how it affects our lives, but it is not. It is ignored, unfortunately, in the planning process. There are some studies, especially where we have been involved, that we kind of push for the sunlight as a study object, but most of the communal, like the municipality services, they talk about shadow study. Now,
Right.
shadow study is a great tool, and I think that it's a great tool for the neighbor to open a website, like for example, Shadowmap, and see, oh, look here, I'm going to be shaded. However, the next step is to talk about hours of sunlight. We need to move from the shadow to the sunlight. So Sweden is not talking, unfortunately, about sunlight. And that has to do a little with the fact that the old code didn't have a quantitative requirement, and the new upcoming code has no requirement for sunlight.
So can I just
Yeah.
so thank you so much for the clarification,
Yeah.
because my brain gets confused between daylight and sunlight. So it's really good that you kind of made that distinction.
It's two different, yeah.
Of course it's, but you know, I guess, because in my head, like 1% daylight, I mean, wow. I mean, that's even worse than 1% sunlight, you know, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand. Yeah. It's, although it's a quantitative requirement, and it's, we could have more, but unfortunately it doesn't refer to the sun, you know, this bright thing there.
No, but it's interesting. I mean, for the first time I slept in a hotel room. I dropped my son off at university. I was telling Mina, my parting gift to him, by the way, was an incandescent bulb to give him some infrared. So yeah, £3 I spent on it, or
nice.
€3 I spent on it. So, but we stayed in a hotel with no outside window, and I think it was the first time I've ever stayed in and it, by the end of the day 2, like I said to my wife, you have to go. I can't stand it anymore. And it sort of just shows you the impact that this can have. You know, that was one day, you know, and if people are living in places, you can really understand how important all of these things are.
Yeah. Was this in UK?
This was in the UK. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's quite good that Sweden has all this, like they're trying to guard in some way. However, there is a lot of things that could be done more, especially in the urban planning. And in the urban planning, I really like the comment from Susanne about the geometrical, like the geometry, like how the old codes used to have this just you know, geometry and volume measurements that were giving the instructions on how to do the urban design, and that is how it is in Greece, actually, talking about connection to South Europe. Like in Greece, there is no quantitative requirement for daylight. We don't have daylight factor in the code. However, there is a lot of like measurements somebody has to take in order to be able to get the ideal volume, as it is called by the older architects. So we have this protection when it comes to urban design, that there has to be some withdrawal of the top floors, so that you get access to the sky view, so that you get access to daylight, to ventilation, something quite more important in South Europe. So it is actually interesting. I didn't know this about Sweden, that although we had these geometrical requirements, this geometry things like, you know, distance from the street, the height of the building, moving on to the future, moving on to nowadays that we have simulation tools, 3D tools, people tend to forget the base.
Yes.
People tend to forget oh yeah, you know, like maybe I need to measure the street, and maybe my building doesn't have to be higher than the street, or I can have some floors that are draw like they are more to the inside of the plot. So I really like this comment. I didn't know actually that Sweden had these rules and said, it's fine now, people know, because they don't,
Right.
apparently.
Well,
Yeah.
it seems to be so often the way on this topic that in the past they had more of a handle as to what was going on and why they were doing it. And so I mean, I guess you know, when you sort of think about and I guess this is for all of you, but when you think about like what needs to be done going forward, it sounds like there does need to be more work put into things like sunlight and daylight and planning. You know, this sounds like a really important topic. So what should be done, do you think, or what should be people be kind of researching and looking at now? Efter here, if you want to start with that.
Well, I cannot say what needs to be done. Of course, I would love to, you know, to have more clarified laws and more, you know, like clear laws, more quantitative requirements. However, one of the things that for me it's the most important is the democratization of the process,
right,
of urban design. So, of course, Sweden and Greece and most European countries have open platforms where people can discuss and can see the suggestions. However, that is something that is not known to everybody. So you can see, and Susanne might have more examples of that in Stockholm, but you can see cases where you have like a neighborhood that it's older people, that they are natives, like Swedish people, and they know how the things work. So they have access and are able to change. But then you have neighborhoods where densification happens more intensively, but there are neighborhoods with more immigrants that don't know exactly how things work. And there you notice that people do not know the processes, people do not know what is happening, who they can contact, how they can appeal a decision and everything. So I think for me that is the most, we need more education to the people, to actual citizens, to know like how they can affect a decision.
No, interesting. And Susanne, I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I'm also the thing that you said, which sort of struck me, and I think Mina mentioned it as well, is about the fact that the legislation is there for new builds rather than existing dwellings as well. So, you know, which seems sort of strange in many ways. So I wonder if you could talk about that, but then, you know, open it up to things that you think could happen and research that needs to be undertaken.
Yeah, that's what I was so fascinated with when I started to realize that it is like that, that in Sweden there's no law that protects how much the access to daylight may be impaired for existing buildings. It's like Mina said, in Norway, the building code only applies to new construction. So as the legislation is designed, the planning may take place in the vicinity of existing building as long as it does not constitute a so-called significant inconvenience. And that can only be decided in court. And that is the thing, because there is no rules or regulations for existing buildings. All these cases have to be decided in the courts, and they have to decide if it is a significant inconvenience or not. And they also have to decide if the daylight is sufficient, so-called. But there's no way to measure exactly what is sufficient or what is a significant inconvenience, as it is for new construction, where you have this 1%. Even if it's low, it still is something that you can measure and hold on to. So that's why I think it's been really interesting also to look at how the courts argue in their, how do you call it, in their, in their rulings or their judgments. For example, you can find sometimes that because outlook is also a part of daylight, and that has now been removed from the new building code. There is no demand. There is a demand for outlook from areas where you eat or like living room, but not any longer for the bedroom. And then they argue that that is not as important. And then I, in my view, you can just as well argue the opposite, that for someone who is sick or confined to bed for one reason or the other for a longer period, it can be very important to have an outlook from your bedroom window. It was interesting when you mentioned the hotel with no window, and after only 24 hours, you just wanted to get out of there.
Well, I totally. And I mean, I think, if you think about aging populations as well, and people going into care homes, and, if we don't protect all of these things, then, I guess people's mental health and, their wellness will really, really suffer. So it's kind of fascinating to kind of hear what's going on. And I mean, Mina, I just wondered, in terms of the research that you did, did you come to any conclusions about the right model that people should be applying, or countries should be applying to this?
I looked very much up to the right of light and the guidance that BR 209 provides, with calculations of vertical sky components on the facade. And I also, with my master thesis, I also did a case study to see how the daylight is treated in existing buildings. And what I found is very similar to what Eftia and Susanne is talking about, that the people with the knowledge and know where to look, and they can kind of defend their daylight, and the people with maybe immigrants or other neighborhoods, they don't understand that which oh, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Yeah.
So they don't
Yeah.
understand what the legislation or the law may be, or who to talk to.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So it provides a very different, or provides a very large gap between groups in the society. And also my case study found that in Norway, it can be very expensive to try to defend your daylight. You need lawyers, daylight consultants, and yes, you need to know the knowledge yourself. And that is why, like, a tool like Shadowmap, it's such a good, and even the free version is such a good tool for, and easy to understand.
Well, I mean, it is. You're right. It is amazing how easily
is.
you can kind of look at the impact of build, and the ability actually to put in new buildings as well, and sort of model all of that out. I think is very cool. So I would say that myself.
Yeah,
so,
and easy to use. So,
but I think that FTE is, you use the word democratization, and I think that's exactly what you're saying, Mina, as well, that this process, because we might be sort of sleepwalking ourselves into a situation where only the rich can afford to kind of fight this, and that isn't good for society at the end of the day.
Yeah, and the rich can always move to an apartment with better lighting if their daylight is affected. So
or Hawaii. So
yes.
Nice.
Although from what I understand, they're building bunkers in Hawaii, so they're going up the ground.
No daylight there.
No
daylight there. No. So
thinking about the Korean film Parasite, I think often films can be very telling. The poor people, they basically live in the basement with, and the rich people, they live on top of a hill. But it's so.
you're totally right. Totally right. I think it's such a fascinating topic.
Yeah, I wanted to add a little the fact that, however, that in Sweden, if I'm not wrong, you don't need as a private person to hire the daylight specialist or the lawyer, as long as you manage in written and with a free tool or with any other way manage to convince the commune, the municipality, that they need to force the developer to do this study. So we have had a case where a very well written statement with angles and lines on a paper could force the municipality to demand the developer to pay for that. And that goes again to the fact that if you have the knowledge that you can appeal it, you don't need exactly the tools, you just need the will and to know how to write it down.
But it's so often, how do you get started on it? Because I can imagine, like, I live in a nice house in the English countryside. If someone came and decided to put up a huge tower block next to me, it'd be like, where do you kind of start in terms of that process? And again, things like Shadowmap are a great way of, you can start modeling all of this out, and it often is a good point to sort of start that process off, isn't it?
Yep. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, listen, we're running short on time. I just wondered if there's any of you've got anything else that you wanted to add, because I mean, I'm walking away from this having learned an awful lot about the whole process, and even again, just to kind of remember that daylight and sunlight are different things. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Sorry,
Yes.
I'm just curious whether, because it's funny that we have these double standards for existing buildings and new construction. I mean, maybe there are other areas as well where there are double standards, but I'm curious whether we will see in the future that they will start to apply an exact rule as we have for new construction for the existing buildings. I don't know what you say, FTE and Mina.
I think to answer, I mean, I would love if that could happen, if we would have like a more specific requirement for the existing as we have for the new. But I think that it's also essential to go back to the basics, like to be able to recognize a very narrow street and a very high building from the actual educate the lawmakers, educate the judges, And I think that you and Paul have done a lecture in the appealing court, right? So I think that's a good step. So I think that's also something together with new quantitative requirements.
Very interesting. Perfect. Well, listen, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation.